So, artificial consciousness. So if consciousness is hard, artificial consciousness is like ridiculous. So I thought for today, like, have a bit of a different format. So the presentation will be a bit shorter, and then like try and sort of workshop some ideas later, because honestly, like, any person's guess is like as good as anyone else's. So yeah. But the things I want to talk about is like summarize again like what the issue is with consciousness, like the problems there. And as we're going into the artificial realm, like before we get to artificial consciousness, talk a bit about artificial intelligence and intelligence in general. And as always, there's metaphysics, because this is all philosophy, because no one knows. So yeah, some of the philosophical challenges and kind of like what people are thinking about in this domain currently, like what this synthetic artificial consciousness thing could be, and then yeah, let's jump in the workshop. So what is consciousness? We don't know, and we, emphasizing the quotes, is the Western mind, because as we talked about many times, Eastern cultures, shamanic cultures have a very different approach to how they understand and live and experience reality and their consciousness. So this is really from a rational Western perspective, where we're trying to objectify kind of this concept of consciousness, which we are, and we're pretty bad at it. So just to give you an idea how bad, I already once talked about this paper, this guy called Robert Kuhn. He has a channel on YouTube called Closer to Truth, and he's interviewed like hundreds of academics, so like physicists and neuroscientists and philosophers, and he does like all these cool sort of topics. Like one is on sort of the information theoretical perception of reality, and one is about consciousness. And so he summarized this in this paper from this year, and there's like 200 philosophy of mind explanations for consciousness he kind of goes through. So this is like from about 200 academics, because everyone has more or less their idea, although you can like bunch them together. So this is like from physicalism, where it's like, well, yeah, consciousness is just the brain computing, obviously, to like more crazy stuff like sort of quantum ideas, like Roger Penrose presented, or like going all the way to idealism and sort of mysticism. So he was like, yeah, kind of, if we have more than 200 theories of consciousness, obviously we have no clue what it is. So yeah, so much for that. But what we do know, kind of summarized, so William James was kind of a pioneering psychologist and turned philosopher when he did his kind of experiments with nitrous oxide, had his psychedelic experiences, where he kind of read about some other guy, Benjamin Blood, who wrote this crazy article about his nitrous oxide psychedelic experiences, and James was like, I kind of don't believe it, and took it himself, and then he was like, okay, wow, this is a problem, and he kind of like, yeah, for the rest of his academic career and life, he was kind of battling with this kind of, with what it means, what did he experience, what does it mean? And so he was one of the first people to talk about consciousness being this river, this stream of consciousness. So kind of like one of the first sort of kind of having this idea of like sort of flowing through this experiential kind of multiverse, also a word that he coined. And then in 1929 we have Clarence something Lewis, and he kind of modernized this idea of qualia, which is kind of one unit of subjective experience. So the greenness of green, because green doesn't exist. Green is just wavelength of whatever nanometers, and your experience of greenness is something that happens inside your perception, and it's a qualia, it's or a quale if it's just one, and kind of this idea of kind of these atoms of experiential things like pain or love or yeah, and kind of perception, colors. So these are all qualia. And then a long jump till 74, when Thomas Nagel said, what would it be like to be a bat? Like, how would you perceive reality? And yeah, that's kind of still the best definition for what consciousness is. Consciousness is if it feels like to be something, so there's an inner perspective outward into the world. And then another jump to 1990 when Francis Crick and Christoph Koch presented this work on neural correlates of consciousness, and it was called Towards a Neurobiological Theory of Consciousness. And I also talked about this, that Crick, he'd already won a Nobel Prize, he was an older dude, and people told Koch, hey, just don't touch this crazy subject of consciousness. It's bad for your academic career, because you can do this if you're like an older dude, like Crick, that's fun, but don't do that because that'll just like kill your career. So he was brave enough to do this and kind of like, yeah, started this sort of modern neuroscience in academia. And then a couple of years later, David Chalmers came and kind of like really sort of put the nail in it by asking like, how can stuff have both a physical and a phenomenological quality? Like, how can non-mental stuff become mental or produce this inner perspective? How is this possible? 30 years later, we're still arguing about this. Some philosophers of mind are even arguing if this is even a problem at all. Is it made up? Is it like not a thing? Others are like, yes, this is like the central thing. How do you, basically it's like a shift from, how do you go from an objective to a subjective point of view? And this somehow doesn't work. And this is kind of all the problem with sort of science, that science is always kind of this outside objective description of reality, but everything that we do and live is from our inside, kind of our phenomenological perspective, and they just somehow don't meet. And then in 1995, Ned Block came up with the idea of, let's call this the thing that's happening to us now, phenomenological, too many PHs, phenomenal consciousness, which is just the sum of all the qualia. So kind of the qualia universe built up of these atoms is this thing that he named. And then a year later, Chalmers came up with this idea of philosophical zombies, which, as I talked about, annoyed some of the philosophers because they were thinking this is now getting a bit silly and like these are just like stupid ideas. But it somehow seems to be an important distinction, especially what we're talking about later on, because a philosophical zombie from the outside looks like a sentient person. Like you wouldn't like see the difference in any way, but the difference is that there is no inner perspective. So this is just, there's like no lights inside, there's no one looking out. This is just like function, and it just appears to be or behave like a human, but there's no sensation, there's no one registering qualia. So this was kind of his idea of philosophical zombies. Like, how would you like distinguish and know if like, or how would you sort of, yeah, understand this? So what's intelligence? Well, artificial intelligence tells us that this is the ability to learn from experience, adapt to new situations, solve problems, apply knowledge effectively. And it encompasses things like reasoning, understanding, creativity, and the capacity to process information and make decisions. So for intelligence, you need memory, you need information processing and exchange. It's somehow related to knowledge and problem solving. It's something adaptive. It's always like dynamic, and it's emergent. It just like pops out, and somehow you don't need consciousness. And it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So in the 90s, when scientists started to look at cells, they were like, wow, this is super complicated. Even a single cell is like, it's this machine. And then they started to like think about cells in sort of this metaphor of like mechanics. It's a machine, it's a factory, super complex. And like nowadays, biologists are thinking that actually that doesn't do it justice, because a cell is so much more dynamic and adaptive than a machine, and that they're saying that kind of this machine picture of a cell is just like, no, it's a lot more complex. It's like a lot more intelligent in the way it kind of can adapt. And things like collective intelligence, like where exactly does this latch onto? Where, like, you have these termites, they have ventilation shafts, they build them, like not a single termite knows what to do, but in the collective they kind of do these things. Or you have ants that kind of milk these aphids, and when it rains they kind of take them in like cattle. Like super intelligent behavior without brains or like neural systems. Or parasites. So I don't know if you know this liver fluke thing. So it does sexual reproduction in herbivores. Then it gets dumped on the field with the feces. Then a snail comes along and it kind of goes into the snail. From the snail it travels to an ant. In the ant it hijacks its motor systems, makes the ant crawl up on the top of the grass, so it's again eaten by a herbivore, and that completes the cycle. I have no idea how this how does this emerge evolutionary, but this seems to me like that's really intelligent. I mean, that's like crazy intelligent. That's like, or like pest control. I mean, you're like trying to get rid of these little insects, and apparently they're so intelligent that like we humans struggle and have like we don't really know like how to adapt to these things being super smart without the intention of doing this. So intelligence seems to be something which is everywhere, and now maybe kind of in a non-biological context it seems to be emergent in the technologies we build. So AI, well, some people say it kind of is just like, it's just statistical stuff, it's just computation, it's data driven, it's decision making, and it's just like processing tons of data, and it kind of pretends to be intelligent. So you're kind of fooled if you think artificial intelligence is intelligent, because it's not. It's just like, it's algorithms, so how can this be intelligent? And other people are like, okay, maybe this is like the next level of like emergent intelligence appearing in our universe here on Earth. And this kind of is foreshadowing kind of the discussion of artificial consciousness, like, yeah, which one is it? And I don't know, there's this nice channel on YouTube called 3 Blue, 1 Brown, where he has amazing visualizations of these things, like this is the transformer architecture of LLMs with the attention and perceptron levels and like how they work. So I think it's a bit like with animals. Like back in the day, a lot of academics were like, well, animals, they're not really that clever, because it's all like instinct. They don't have desires or like humans. So they're just like these little robots just running around doing stuff. And we've kind of revised this sort of view of animals. And I mean, anybody who grew up with pets kind of knew this was wrong, because if you have a pet, you just realize that there is like so much going on. And I find people who work like with AI, like myself, I kind of tend to be there. I find that people who don't really use it are like, yeah, it must be that. How can it be like anything else? And again, you could be fooled, but I just feel like some of the interactions I've had with AI, I'm like, damn, that's like, something's going on there. I feel, but yeah. So, the metaphysics in the philosophy of mind. So, down here, physicalism. So, the universe is made up of physical stuff. You have a bunch of interactions. Actually, there's like 4 laws of nature. That's it. Everything else comes out of it. And if we don't understand it yet, we will later on, surely. So consciousness is like, it's just computation of neurons, and we'll understand it one day. And again, as I mentioned a couple of times, physicalism is a metaphysical belief, because nowhere in physics or in the mathematics of physics is this required. So this is just something which is like implicit, felt natural, like if you're rational, common sense, this is kind of what you would think. Although like even over 100 years ago, quantum mechanics like just blew the whole logic, rational, common sense thing out of the water, because like the quantum world is totally bizarre, but still like most rational people are like, yeah, this is kind of all it is, and it kind of like interacts, and somehow stuff comes out. And then you have like interesting ideas like epiphenomenalism, which says, yeah, there's these mental states that come out of this computation, but mental states don't have a causal like reach into the physical. So you don't have free will. How could you? Because that would be like a new sort of causal thing. So you think you have free will, but that's all an illusion, because that's just kind of a byproduct of like this consciousness thing that popped out. Or functionalism, which says, okay, let's just look at behavior and like forget about like how it's instantiated. So this is something that already could like work for artificial consciousness, because you're not really looking at the substrate, but just kind of at the behaviors. This here is kind of the information theoretic point of view. So you can like reduce all of physics to the concept of information and derive like a lot of the stuff that comes out, although like there's no proper definition of information, so it's like with consciousness. But in the philosophy of mind, Christoph Koch had this idea of integrated information theory, where he was saying, consciousness happens if stuff starts to integrate and compute information, then suddenly this inner perspective pops out. And because he's a very respected neuroscientist, people were like, okay, this kind of maybe makes sense, because although it's kind of it's a bit of an unorthodox thing, or it's like hard to sort of justify. Again, it's just like, kind of a belief he has.
Is it emergence, or what happens there?
Well, you know, there's like kind of these measures of integration and how it computes. So there was this perturbation complexity index where you can like measure this in the brain, and then you can like see if a person is awake or asleep or under an anesthetic. And so that's kind of like, sort of, basically if your smartphone is doing these things, then the chances are high that it would sort of start to develop an inner perspective and like consciousness. But again, it's controversial. And then like for physics, John Wheeler was like the guy who brought this information paradigm into physics, this it from bit. But interestingly, in the German-speaking sphere of influence, Carl von Weizsäcker, he was one of the biggest physicists of the 20th century. 20 years before Wheeler, he already kind of started to think about this information theoretic view of the world. Actually, von Weizsäcker invited Wheeler to some conference on information, like way in the beginning, but Wheeler never ever referenced or kind of mentioned von Weizsäcker. And Gernitz was one of his students of von Weizsäcker, and he really kind of made this whole sort of theory of everything out of this idea of this informational sort of ontology, and he called it protoposis, whatever, I don't know how to pronounce it. And this is like how sort of consciousness would emerge in such a framework. Unfortunately, Gernitz only published in German, so no one knows about this. And then we have the quantum stuff. So we talked about Penrose being one of the first sort of academics, even before Koch and Crick, to talk about like, hey, what is consciousness? Like, how can we sort of tackle or grapple with this? And he came up with sort of this, it must be some quantum processes in the brain. And then he met Hameroff, who was this anesthetist. And then he was like, microtubuli in the brain, kind of these structures and the quantum processes and whatever. But actually there's like pioneers of quantum physics like Henry Stapp and David Bohm, who were thinking about these things way earlier and kind of had implicit ideas of consciousness in their theories. And then more recently, Carlo Rovelli, who came up with this relational quantum mechanics. So it's all about relations, and this is called structural realism, where you say, hey, it's not the stuff, kind of the nodes in the network that are important, it's the relational stuff. So you kind of just switch your perspective from kind of the things to the interactions, and he kind of has ideas on consciousness there. And in another corner we have kind of more the sort of the more philosophical stuff. So this is neutral monism, is like pre-Socratic philosophers were like, hey, there's just one substance to reality, but we don't really care if it's mental or physical. It's like, but it's just one, and whatever we see, the mental and the physical, is like derived from that, but it's just unified in this not to be mentioned whatever it is. And then we have Descartes, who was like, no, it's dualism. So you have mind stuff and you have physical stuff, and they're distinct, and there's no way you can bring them together and bridge this gap. And then the more funky stuff, panpsychism, so kind of everything has a little bit of consciousness scattered around. Actually, integrated information theory kind of implies panpsychism. And there's like, I forget who it was, one of the pioneers, like really big name.
Spinoza?
No, for a quantum physicist, who was like saying, hey, I believe that even an electron has like a little quantum of consciousness. And so kind of this idea has been around for a while, although, I mean, there's like a long intellectual history, but that it also kind of like emerged in physics. Problem with panpsychism is, how do you combine stuff? So if you have individual things that are conscious, how do you combine them to have a unified experience of consciousness? And then going all the way down the rabbit hole is idealism. Everything is consciousness, and the physical is just derived from this. So kind of everything you see is basically, behind that is this field of consciousness. And then the question is like, okay, and then what I do is I write them down as a response and push them out. So from the outside, people would think that there's a Chinese-speaking, understanding person inside, but the person inside has no clue. He's just manipulating symbols according to a rule book. So his argument was like, that's what computers do. They have no clue what they're doing. This is just an algorithm, a recipe, and it appears to like imply that there's like understanding going on, but there isn't. And again, the philosophical zombies we mentioned, like, this is basically the problem of other minds. How do I know that you guys have an inner perspective? I don't, and there's no way you can like convince me. But of course, you kind of would be weird if I'm like the only sort of conscious being, unless of course you're into solipsism, which says actually it's only your mind that exists, everything else is like in there, so there's no tangible reality, there's nothing out there, everything is like a construct of my own mind, which sounds really scary, and there's no way to diffuse solipsism. There's like no theoretical or empirical argument to say that this is a terribly stupid idea, because I mean that if this would be true, it's like it's ridiculous, but there's no way to know this. So yeah, if we don't know this for consciousness, then for artificial consciousness it looks even worse. And maybe things can only be conscious if they're embodied. So that's also a theory, that you need to have like a body you operate, and kind of an inside-outside thing, physical sort of a boundary that kind of allows consciousness to emerge. And you need to have agency. So kind of you want to do things. So would a computer, would artificial consciousness, would that thing like want stuff, or like have ambitions, or like have agency? And like emotions, would like, what are those? Where do those factor in? Like would ever like, I don't know, software be sad, or like how would you? Sorry.
Have a bad day.
Yeah, and like how would you even want to like put that in if you were? So embodiment, of course, you can do. You build robots, put in AI, but like how would you get emotionality in there, and would you need it? And if you have a machine that's conscious, the thing never dies as long as the energy is like switched on. So this is like something which potentially would have an infinite lifespan, which could continuously be developed and made better, which is kind of weird, because the whole kind of biological thing is that you have cycles. The thing dies and it varies and it changes and it explores different evolutionary paths. So here you kind of have sort of set paths which just never will diverge and just continue to be, and maybe become more sophisticated. So that's like also sort of a weird concept, like how that would sort of fit into like our sort of, if we think about the future, if this ever emerges. And also that we like oh, the big words I can't pronounce today, sorry. But I mean, we're always like assuming that it's like the thing that we feel So we kind of expect consciousness to be something that we would recognize. So, I mean, like imagining a color that you've never seen, how would you imagine consciousness that's different to ours, alien consciousness? Or is that not even possible? Is like consciousness something that would kind of always feel like to be something, or I don't know, or could it be like something totally wild that we wouldn't even recognize? And yeah, the ethical implications. So as I mentioned, like at one point we thought, yeah, maybe animals should be treated better because they probably suffer and have rich inner lives. And recently they extended this to maybe fish and octopuses and like maybe even, yeah, definitely birds and stuff. But like, what about plants? So there was a nice talk about like sort of plant intelligence, where plants have memory, they can react, they seem to have agency. So what is our relationship to plants if we kind of give them personhood, and should we, and like what does that mean? Because obviously we can't photosynthesize, so we need to eat plants. So it's like, I mean, you can be vegan, but even as a vegan, you like, there's no way. So like, what does that mean? Like, how do you then start to like deal with this ethical, or like how important would this ethical problem be in like overall sort of survival? And maybe now it's like the time to sort of expand our ethical sort of considerations and think about artificial consciousness. So kind of weird. So it's kind of got more wider and more sort of weirder as we went along.
James, what do they think about this altered states of consciousness? You say anthropomorphizing consciousness.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah?
Yeah, but we also don't know how much potential we already have to go into different states of consciousness. When we go into altered states of consciousness, we probably leave this consciousness and go to some other level. So
that's a good question, because would artificial consciousness be able to do that as well, like get high? Could that have a psychedelic experience or not?
Well, animals consume alcohol, right? I mean, that's been shown, you know, that quite some animals consume alcohol. You've got those ants, you know, that also, consume stuff, right? So
dolphins that kind of get the pufferfish to excrete toxins to get high.
Yeah, I think the clue is to not get stuck on that our more subjective form of consciousness is the universal norm. And
yep.
So the altered states that we also experience are a clue that everything else that may experience consciousness probably doesn't experience it the same way that we do.
Yep. Which means that the whole thing we kind of live in is this thin slice of sober waking consciousness, and there's like such a huge kind of like multiverse of like experiences that are possible. So maybe that's the thing, like what would artificial consciousness be able to experience in like what depth, or what form? So maybe that's would be a good way to frame it. And the experts, so I mean basically we're all the experts because we're sentient beings. I just took because like this quarrel in the philosophy of mind, from physicalism to idealism to whatever, doesn't go anywhere. So this discussion isn't going anywhere either. Like, is artificial consciousness possible or no? Yes or no? So I mean, this is just endless like metaphysical discussions. But Chalmers was like, hey, biology pulled it off, so maybe silicon can pull this off as well. And Koch was like, yeah, I mean, basically saying how this would work. It's like one instantiation just with like information processing. And then you have Anil Seth, kind of the famous neuroscientist, and he's more skeptical. He's like, somehow biology seems to be special, so probably not, but we should be careful to like not exclude this, because as we did with animals and whatever, let's be careful. And then we have Bernardo Kastrup, the computer scientist turned idealist philosopher of mind, and he's like, no way. So biology, especially metabolism, is so different to anything everywhere we've ever seen, and kind of this seems to be the precursor for having like the biological sort of machinery to be able to have conscious experiences. There is no way this can be replicated in any other way than kind of biology and metabolic paths. So, but then, like, okay, maybe we can like do more about how we would sort of detect this. So This year came out last year. It's like 120 pages. There are 19 computer scientists, neuroscientists, and philosophers, and they kind of came up with 14 indicators of what it would mean to be artificially conscious. And they conclude like, okay, currently no AI are conscious according to these indicators, but there's no obvious technical barrier to building AI systems which would satisfy these indicators, so basically leaving the door open. And like Susan Schneider, who is a philosopher and also kind of AI expert, she was like, what would happen if we would train AI without any conception of consciousness? So anything regarding consciousness is not in the training data, nothing, zero, like everything is taken out. And then you start to ask it like questions related to consciousness and being and experience. And if it would then start to sort of claim it has consciousness, maybe that's kind of a good start. But again, the machine could be telling you anything and you would never know. So to conclude, rational consciousness has a hard time understanding its own experiential nature, and any sentient being like has a metaphysical position that is just as valid as anyone else's. So let's workshop some of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.